pandemic was primarily about saving lives, why did nothing happen until it affected the stock market? Hello there, you 5.6 million Awakening Wonders. Thank you for joining me on this voyage towards the light. If you're not a subscriber yet, please subscribe right now. Now, as you're aware, we were told that the response to the pandemic was about saving lives. Whether it was the vaccine mandates or the lockdown response, everything was focused on human lives. Everything was focused on health. In my conversation with Matt Stoller on my podcast Under the Skin, we talked about how the pandemic was essentially ignored until it began to affect stock prices. Conversations of this nature are fantastic because Matt is a Washington insider with a completely different perspective on politics from most ordinary people. Stay with this conversation to the very end and let me know what you think of it in the comments. I feel that we have to do something somewhat radical, Matt, and I don't know why someone as bold in their thinking and as articulate in their communication as you would assume that it has to be sort of housed within the two legal entities that you've described.
Well, so this is a really good point. I mean, I think the radical piece that's sort of drained out of U.S. politics, Western politics presumably, but U.S. politics more, is the metaphysical question of Judeo-Christian, the ethical foundations of the American state are religious, and that, I mean, I think people when people don't have a metaphysical language to communicate with each other, they create cults, and I think that a lot of the culture warring that you see is imbuing like traditional sanctification over political figures. Like if you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, what people were saying about her was effectively making her a saint, right? All the religious iconography. The same thing's true. Like on the Democratic side, you see a huge amount of sanctification of cults of personality, basically. And I think you see that on the right somewhat as well. I would say, when I talk about like the turgid nature, the slow nature, like it's very exciting intellectually. But I will say that the reason it's so slow, there's nothing inherently slow about bureaucracies. We happen to have bureaucracies that are slow by design right now. The reason is because the Federal Reserve has been printing, I'd say something like since the financial crisis, they printed about $9 trillion. Which was a friend of mine wrote a book called The Lords of Easy Money about the Federal Reserve. And he says they printed 600 years of money within the span of 10 years or something like that. And when you do that, what happens is the culture becomes one on which commerce is a big part of human society, right? Always has been. Commerce becomes less about doing things, building things that may solve a purpose, and more about hustling over how to get a financial asset that will escalate in value. Yeah. And so right now we're in this very weird, of the last 10 years since the financial crisis, or I say the first financial crisis, but it's the last 12, 14 years since that financial crisis, we've been in this very strange period where people think about government and commerce and finance and stuff as like, how do we rush to get in on the next asset valuation craze, and nobody in government wants to do anything to affect that. So the bureaucracy, and I mean Greece, Podemos, all those guys, Syriza, they all failed, right? Because they were caught in the same financial trap, which is we need to sustain high financial asset values, or else people will lose the perception of what they have, their perception that they have this wealth, as opposed to actual wealth, which is being able to make things that people need. And so we're kind of trapped right now in a financial system which has excessively elevated asset values. And if we try to change anything, that will lower asset values and cause a reordering of our social hierarchies. And so when the Fed right now has to actually pop those asset bubbles, and when the Fed does that, when you do see a financial shakeup, right, then what you will see is all of a sudden things can move really quickly. So I don't know if I was paying attention to COVID in January and February because I'm obsessed with China, and they were oh, there's this respiratory disease coming from China, January, February of 2020. There's this respiratory disease in China that's shutting down the country. And I'm that seems bad. And I was freaking out about it and being stocking up on food and medical stuff and doomer prep stuff. And but the moment when policy elites in the US took it seriously, and I'll never forget this, it's not when like public health people were like, oh, maybe this is a thing. It's when the stock market went down, right? It's like then people were like, oh, this is serious. People with money are actually like betting on this being a thing, right? And so that's how we determine, you want to get really like at the core of how we think about policy. It's all about whether the stock market is going up and down. And it's been that way since probably the 1980s. It's not inherent to capitalism. There is no such thing. I don't think there is such a thing as capitalism. I think we have lots of different systems over time. Things are very flexible, as you noted. Humans can live in all sorts of different ways. What the problem, like what FDR did in the 30s was not that he made the stock market go up or down. His main accomplishment was making the stock market irrelevant. And that's what we need to get to. We need to make these financial markets irrelevant to how we make social decisions. And right now, they are so dominant because of the policies that the Federal Reserve, this kind of like the ultimate deep state institution, has pursued to warp our economy and ultimately warp ourselves. And that's like, right. you want the revolution. It's going to happen, an intellectual revolution, a peaceful, transition. It's going to happen when this huge, like trillions and trillions of dollars of asset bubbles, when that pops, we're gonna have to reorient and reconfigure how we do things. That could be very dark, it could be very good, but that is like how I think about it. So what is creating the stagnation and the bureaucracy is this unreal moment of like bubble finance.
That's beautiful. Yeah, so it's an abstraction to some degree. Like when you talk about like 600 years worth of finance being pumped out in a 10-year period, when you talk about a kind of a constructed reality, an economic reality that's sort of faith-based and confidence-based and requires our commitment in order to exist, and that then begins to determine political decisions and like a global level. When one says from a metaphysical perspective, we're living in an illusion, we actually are. Our reality is being determined by sets of fictions that are no more real than particular sets of religious ideologies. And many of them are tethered to deep archetypal emotions that all human beings feel and are sort of somewhat ubiquitous, somewhat universal even, and perhaps therefore have a deeper reality and ought to have a greater influence when it comes to sort of making decisions for how to organise systems, how to organise the planet. Matt, I want to guide you into the choppy waters of the wonderful world of conspiracy. Now, when like
tell you a quick story about how to understand. So there's this part of my book. It's about the 1925 land bubble in Florida. By the way, every financial crisis involves Florida and Citibank. Those are the two things. That is one thing I learned in my book and when doing research. So there was this town. Everybody was speculating on Florida real estate, and in the 20s, and like people hadn't been to, they didn't care if they were in Florida. Like they were just trading lots of land. And there was this one town called Nettie that became like there was speculative fervor, and people were trading lots of land and buying and selling it. And it turns out later on, people realized that Nettie didn't actually exist. And it's a great story because when you have a lot of land in Nettie and someone is willing to buy it for a certain amount of money, even though it doesn't exist, even though the reference point doesn't exist, it still has value, right? The fraud has value until it doesn't, right? And that's what's weird about like a financial bubble, is that things are frauds, or they are just like completely disconnected from anything in reality, but they still have value as long as the fraud keeps going, as long as the Ponzi keeps going. And that's kind of like where we are, I think, right now, where a lot of things that people are like, this is crazy, this doesn't seem to make any sense. You could look at like crypto or meme stocks or whatever it is. They're like, this is nuts. But it's like, it's true, it's nuts. But as long as the music keeps going, right, people are going to keep dancing.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you can hear the rest of it on Under the Skin from Luminary. Let me know in the comments if you agree with Matt Stoller. Let me know if you think that kind of conversation is useful. Give the video a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you can. If you enjoyed that video, have a look at either one of these. Please sign up to the mailing list if you want to hear more stuff from us. But more important than any of that, please stay free.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson's. I'm happy